Hey guys, Mrs. Erickson here, coming to you from my library. And look, there's Kim, Mrs. Rupineski. That's funny, huh? So yesterday, we're in the middle of chapter 6. Yesterday, um, John Thornton bet a man that Buck could pull 1,000 pounds on a sled by himself, also break it free from the ice. So we are going to pick up where we left off. And basically, Thornton is thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did this, but doesn't want to have his bluff called or doesn't want to back down. So Matthewson, which is the guy who bets him, jumps in and says, I've got a sled standing outside now with 25-pound sacks of flour on it, Matthewson went on with brutal directness. So don't let that hinder you. Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face in the absent way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is seeking somewhere to find the thought that will start it going again. The face of Jim O'Brien, a Mastodon king and old-time comrade, caught his eye. It was a cue to him, seeming to rouse him to do what he would never have dreamed of doing. Can you lend me 1,000? He asked, almost in a whisper. Sure, answered O'Brien, thumping down a plethoric sack by the side of Matthewson's. Though it's little faith I have, John, that the beast can do the trick. The El Dorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. The tables were deserted, and the dealers and gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager to lay odds. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, banked around the sled within easy distance. Matthewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours, and in the intense cold, it was 60 below zero. The runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Men offered odds of 2 to 1 that Buck could not budge the sled. A quibble arose concerning the phrase break out. O'Brien contended that it was Thornton's privilege to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from the sleds from a dead standstill. Matthewson insisted that the phrase included breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the snow. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bet decided in his favor, whereat the odds went up 3 to 1 against Buck. There were no takers. Not a man believed him capable of the feat. Thornton had been hurried into the wager, heavy with doubt, and now that he looked at the sled itself, the concrete fact, with the regular team of 10 dogs curled up in the snow before it, the more impossible the task appeared. Matthewson waxed jubilant. 3 to 1, he exclaimed. I'll lay you another 1,000 on that figure, Thornton. What do you say? Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soared above odds, failed to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to all save the clamor of battle. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their socks were slim, and there were, turning a light on so I can actually see. And with his own, the three partners could rake together only $200. In the ebb of their fortunes, this sum was their total capital. Yet they laid it unhesitatingly against Matthewson's 600. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was put into the sled. He had caught the contagion of the excitement, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. Murmurs of admiration at his splendid condition, without any ounce of superfluous flesh, and the 150 pounds that he weighed were so many pounds of grit and virility. His furry coat shone with the sheen of silk down the neck and across the shoulders. His mane, in repose as it was, half bristled and seemed to lift with every movement, as though excess of vigor made each particular hair alive and active. The great breast and heavy forelegs were no more than in proportion to the rest of the body, where the muscles showed in tight rolls underneath the skin. Men felt these muscles and proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down to 2 to 1. Gad, sir, stuttered a member of the latest dynasty, a king of the Skookum benches. I offer you 800 for him, sir, before the test, sir. 800, just as he stands. Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. You must stand off from him, Mathewson protested. Free play and plenty of room. The crowd fell silent. Only could be heard the voices of the gamblers vainly offering 2 to 1. Everybody acknowledged Buck a magnificent animal, but 20, 50-pound sacks of flour bulked too large in their eyes for them to loosen 3 pouch strings. Not 3. For them to loosen their pouch strings. Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took his head in his 2 hands and rested cheek to cheek. He did not playfully shake him as he is wont, or murmur soft love curses, but he whispered in his ear, "As you love me, Buck, as you love me," was what he whispered. Buck whined with suppressed eagerness. The crowd was watching curiously. The affair was growing mysterious. It seemed like a conjuration. As Thornton got to his feet, Buck seized his mittened hand between his jaw, pressed it with his teeth, and released slowly, half reluctantly. It was the answer in terms, not of speech, of love. Thornton stepped well back. Now, Buck, he said. Buck tightened the traces, then slacked them for a matter of several inches. It was the way he had learned. Gee, Thornton's voice rang out, sharp in the tense silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement in a plunge that took up the slack and with a sudden jerk arrested his 150 pounds. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackle. Ha! Thornton commanded. Buck duplicated the maneuver, this time to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping, the sled pivoting, and the runners slipped and grated several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Men were holding their breaths intensely, unconscious of the fact. So here is, right there, Buck and Thornton. He's like cheering on. Now mush, Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward, tightening the traces with a jarring lunge. His whole body was gathered compactly together in the tremendous effort, the muscles writhing and knotting like live things under the silky fur. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, the claws scarring the hard-packed snow in parallel grooves. The sled swayed and trembled, half started forward. One of his feet slipped, and one man groaned aloud. Then the sled lurched ahead in what appeared a rapid succession of jerks. Though it never really came to a dead stop again, half an inch, 2 inches. The jerks perceptibly diminished. As the sled gained momentum, he caught them up till it was moving steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again, unaware that for a moment they had ceased to breathe. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. The distance had been measured off, and as he neared the pile of firewood, which marked the end of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man was tearing himself loose, even Mathewson. Hat and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands, and it did not matter with whom, and bubbling over in a general incoherent babble. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head was against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those who hurried up heard him cursing Buck, and he cursed long and fervently, you know what I'm saying, and softly and lovingly. Gad, sir, sputtered the skookum bench king. I'll give you 1,000 for him, sir. 1,000, sir. 1,200, sir. Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. The tears were streaming frankly down his cheeks. Sir, he said to the skookum bench king. No, sir. You can go to hell, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir. Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth, as though animated by a common impulse. The onlookers drew back to the respectful distance, nor were they again indiscreet enough to interrupt. Okay, that's the end of chapter 6. I'm going to read a little bit of chapter 7 because it's really long. just to kind of give us an idea of where we're going with this, and then I'll find a stopping place here in a few pages. Chapter 7, the sounding of the call. When Buck earned $1,700 in 5 minutes for John Thornton, he made it possible for his master to pay off certain debts and to journey with his partners into the East after the fabled lost mine, the history of which was as old and the history of the country. Many men had sought it, few had found it, and more than a few there were who had never returned from the quest. This lost mine was steeped in tragedy and shrouded in mystery. No one knew of the first man. The oldest tradition stopped before it got back to him. From the beginning, there had been an ancient and ramshackle cabin. Dying men had sworn to it, and to the mine, the site of which it marked. Clinching their testimony with nuggets, they were unlike any known grade of gold in the Northland. But no living man had looted this treasure house, and the dead were dead. Wherefore John Thornton and Pete and Hans, with Buck and a half dozen other dogs, faced into the east at an unknown trail to achieve where men and dogs as good as themselves had failed. They sledded 70 miles up the Yukon, swung to the left into the Stewart River, past the Mayo and McQuestion, and held on until the Stewart itself became a streamlet, threading the upstanding peaks which marked the backbone of the continent. John Thornton asked little of man or nature. He was unafraid of the wild. With a handful of salt and a rifle, he could plunge into the wilderness and fare wherever he pleased, as long as he pleased. Being is no haste, Indian fashion. He hunted his dinner in the course of the day's travel, and if he failed to find it, like the Indians, he kept on traveling, secure in the knowledge that sooner or later he would come to it. So on this great journey into the East, straight meat was the bill of the fare. Ammunition and tools principally made up the load on the sled, and the time card was drawn upon the limitless future. To Buck, it was boundless delight, this hunting, fishing, and indefinite wandering through strange places. For weeks at a time, they would hold on steadily, day after day, and for weeks upon end, they would camp here and there, the dogs loafing and the men burning holes through frozen muck and gravel and washing countless pans of dirt by the heat of the fire. Sometimes they went hungry, sometimes they feasted riotously, all according to the abundance of game and the fortune of hunting. Summer arrived, and dogs and men packed on their backs, rafted across blue mountain lakes, and descended or ascended unknown rivers in slender boats whipshod from the standing forest. 2 months came and went, and back and forth they twisted through the uncharted vastness where no men were, and yet where men had been, if the lost cabin were true. They went across divides and summer blizzards, shivered under the midnight sun on naked mountains, between the timberline and the eternal snow, dropping into summer valleys amid swarming gnats and flies, and in the shadows of glaciers picked strawberries and flowers as ripe and fair as any the Southland could boast. In the fall of the year, they penetrated a weird lake country, sad and silent, where wild fowl had been, but where then there was no life, nor sign of life, only the blowing of chill winds, the forming of ice in sheltered places, and the melancholy rippling of waves on lonely beaches. And through another winter, they wandered on, the obliterated trails of men who had gone before. Once they came upon a path blazed through the forest, an ancient path, and the lost cabin seemed very near. But the path began nowhere and ended nowhere, and it remained mystery, as the men who made it and the reason he made it remained mystery. Another time they chanced upon the time-graven wreckage of a hunting lodge, and amid the shreds of rotted blankets, John Thornton found a long-barreled flintlock. He knew it for a Hudson Bay Company gun of the young days in the Northwest, when such a gun was worth its height in beaver skins packed flat. And that was all. No hint as to the man who, in an early day, had reared the lodge and left the gun among the blankets. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We will see you guys again tomorrow. Have a good one.